Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the fantastic presentation so far and the discussions from our tribal leadership and co-management panel. I know I did, and I wanted to thank again Dana Jackson, Professors Mills and Wilkinson, Mr. Martinez and Mr. Lopez for sharing their time and insights with us. And now it's my honor to introduce and moderate our next panel, which features a couple of the past confirmed directors of the BLM. They have a wealth of experience and insight into the agency, its role in the West, and the challenges it faces. And we're starting with two of our former directors who served at somewhat different time periods. So I think that'll also be really good perspective of how their work and their perspective have evolved as directors and since then. So we're going to be joined by Jim Baca, who served as BLM director from 1993 to 1994. Like Secretary Holland, Jim is a native of New Mexico and served as the mayor of Albuquerque from 1997 to 2001. He also served twice as New Mexico Commissioner of Public Lands and retired as the state of New Mexico's Natural Resources Trustee in 2010, and has served on the board of numerous nonprofit organizations. Jim, thanks for being here today. We're also being joined by the most recent confirmed director of the BLM, Neil Kornze, who led the agency from 2014 to 2018. Welcome, Neil. Before becoming director, Neil served as acting as the BLM's Deputy Director for Policy and Programs and Senior Advisor to the Director. In these roles, he worked on a broad range of issues, including renewable and conventional energy development, transmission siting, and conservation policy. Neil currently serves as the CEO of Campion Advocacy Fund and Campion Foundation, a position he's held since 2019. In this role, he oversees grant-making, policy initiatives, and operations, working to protect America's last wild places and combat homelessness in Washington and across the country. Before coming to the BLM, Neil worked as a senior advisor to U.S. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada from 2003 to 2011, working on a variety of public lands issues, including renewable energy development, mining, water, outdoor recreation, rural development, and wildlife. So good preparation. And I'm really looking forward to your perspectives. I'd like to start with some introductory remarks. So Jim, we'll start with you, if that's okay.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I look back on my time as director of the BLM, short as it was, and I really have to say, I don't think there's been a tremendous amount of progress made in protecting public lands by the BLM. And it's certainly not because of the power of the directors or maybe even the wishes of some of the interior secretaries and presidents. I just think it's the incessant ability of the extractive industries to get what they want out of the US Congress. And we have made some great strides, don't get me wrong, I think that's true, but I look back and so far as I can tell, the grazing fees are probably lower than they were 25 years ago or 26 years ago. I don't see any reforms in mining law. I don't see any reforms in oil and gas royalties. And I am hopeful under the new administration that things are going to happen. Certainly being driven by climate change, by what we're seeing happening in the West to our landscapes and watersheds. And so I am very hopeful that the BLM will make progress, come back from Grand Junction to Washington where they'll have a bigger impact and move on, because we just can't waste any more time. And that's about it for me. I'm short and sweet to the point.
I'm trying to remember if I've heard people say you were short and sweet. Okay, but I'll let that go, Jim. So Neil, do you want to share some opening thoughts with us?
You bet. Excuse me, it's great to be with you. And I just note it is still a pandemic, and as would happen, I have a toddler running around the room, so you may hear some noise here and there. But what a wonderful set of presentations that we've heard this morning from the Secretary all the way through. So I just want to compliment the agency and all of its partners for putting this together. I'm here in Seattle on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish and Duwamish people, and I I am going to have to ask for you and Jim to talk for just a second, and I'll be right back.
Well, wait till my dog gets involved. You know, he's laying right here beside me. You know, once again, I'm pretty hopeful. I think the Biden administration is making a really honest stab at climate change, and that surely is going to affect the BLM. We're still waiting for a director to be confirmed, as I understand it. And it's just taking way too long. And it kind of proves my point that as long as you've got these ultra conservative, extractive, industry controlled members of Congress, that they're just going to make it difficult to make progress. I very much want to see this new director put into office. She's just what's needed. I'm proud of the Biden administration for picking her, and I hope they get on with it, Nada. What have you been hearing?
Thanks, Jim.
Are you allowed to say?
Right. You know, I think we're all looking forward to having a confirmed director at the BLM for sure. So thanks for the support and encouragement there. Neil, excellent multitasking again, part of the BLM's multiple use mandate in action, right?
That's right. That's right. Yes, thank you for letting me jump out for just a second. And let me also second my fandom for Tracy. I'm very excited for her to be confirmed, hopefully in the days ahead. So keep an eye out for that. But, you know, I think Jim raised an interesting question about how the BLM can move forward and what the limitations might be. And I want to sort of maybe weave a path to that. I think it's an interesting reflection on a 75th anniversary for the agency. You know, I tend to think of the BLM as one of the oldest organizations in government. Going back, I usually start the clock around 1812 with the start of the General Land Office, since the agency was formed out of the merger of the U.S. Grazing Service and the General Land Office. So I think it's got an enormous, long tradition to reflect on, and I think the multi-generational responsibility that the agency has as it looks forward grows more and more every day as that history, you know, sits behind it. And you know, some of that is good history, some of that is history that we would make different choices today. But I think there is something powerful about what the secretary was talking about with you know, the agency is there to manage lands, not just fiscal year to fiscal year, but for generations. And I think there's no organization that epitomizes that need and that kind of longevity than what is now the Bureau of Land Management. So I think as the agency sort of ponders the wisdom of a decision, I think it is in no way absurd to think out 100 years, 200 years about the impacts of those decisions, because we are standing here and our brethren were sitting there, you know, 200 years ago, making some foundational decisions that we are dealing with today. So, you know, in that context, though, we have multiple crises that Nada, you, and Laura Daniel Davis, and the Secretary, and Tommy Boudreau, and many other terrific leaders are stepping up to tackle. And you know, those include the climate crisis, that includes a nature crisis, a biodiversity crisis. And a lot of things are coming to a head right now. And, you know, I think the BLM has such a broad mission, which I think is one of the reasons that you see it swing in a pendulum-like fashion from time to time between administrations. But I think there's really something important in what Jim was asking about, sort of what tools does it have to make progress? And I think he's talking a lot in the conservation space. And if you think about it, you know, the agency was not necessarily given tools in its early days for any kind of fundamental, durable conservation. It was in 1976, when FLPMA was passed, that there was an amendment to the Wilderness Act, which welcomed the BLM into that cadre, where Congress could then evaluate lands, pass bills, bring wilderness, onto the map. And then later, as Charles was talking about in the last panel, in 1996, a new type of durability was brought forward when, for the first time ever, a president used the Antiquities Act of 1908, so it had been a long time of not using it, to create a national monument and leave it in the hands of the agency as part of a challenge to the agency to really lift up and embrace its conservation mission. And it has grown by leaps and bounds through those tools since 1976, since 1996. But Jim, I think there's a tension there in that if you look at those tools, one belongs to Congress and the other one belongs to the president. And the availability of a durable conservation tools, there are in fact probably not enough that sit in the hands of someone who's sitting where NADA sits, or someone that sits in the secretary's seat. So I think that's a challenge that sits in front of our country, that not only does the agency need those types of tools so they can make long-term durable decisions that have communities and conservation in mind, they also need staffing, right? You look at, I thought NADA's opening was terrific, the finest public land agency in the country, absolutely. People are second to none. The work is phenomenal. I can't believe what the agency gets done with the resources that it's given. It covers, I think it's worth repeating this all day long, 10% of the country and 40% of the minerals. So there are very few communities that don't have and need some interaction with the agency. And frankly, the agency is not resourced at a level to be successful in all of those interactions. Right? It is in a per person appropriation and a per acre appropriation. It is way down the chart compared to the other agencies. And so as a result, often ends up moving from crisis to crisis to crisis. And that is not what we want from our public lands and our public land managers. And frankly, we often have higher expectations, but we need to make sure that those public land managers have the tools so that and the personnel and the team so they can be out there and be proactive in doing more than responding to emergencies. So I think there's some interesting questions here about how would you maybe bring forward better tools, right? Maybe part of that is looking at regulations and trying to build something through a regulatory regime. But I also think there's an interesting model in the 1960s, and this was referenced a little bit. I think Monty discussed this in the Public Land Law Review Commission of the 1960s, which was a body that was brought together by Congress. And the outcome of that, well, essentially it was brought together because there had been 3,000 different public land laws passed since the beginning of the country. And it was chaos. And leaders in Congress said, hey, this is too much. We need to actually bring some logic to the pathways here. And so they spent years and years sitting around a table. And I think if we look back at who was sitting around the table, it was probably not nearly a big enough table. And I think it would be very interesting that if we were to launch a second version of that today with a much bigger, more inclusive circle around the table and ask questions, you could either ask them in a singular way in terms of what does the BLM need to answer the crises of the day, but you could also ask a bigger question, which our friend from UC Berkeley asked, which is, we have a lot of public land and natural resource agencies. Is that where we want to be? And so I think there are some really big topics that need to be tackled, need to be answered at that level. And and I'm a hardcore BLM partisan, so don't take the question the wrong way, but I do think that there are, even underneath the agencies, there are authorities that pit the agencies against each other. And so I can tell you, Nada and I haven't discussed this, but I know from sitting where she sits for a little while, that she spends a fair amount of her time deconflicting agency versus agency conflict, right, in order to find a path forward on issues. And that I think that's solvable. And I'll just propose that I think a values-based start to a, if something like this were to kick off at some point, we discovered something really interesting in the late Obama years when we were working on a regulation that got promulgated and then rejected by Congress. We called it Planning 2.0. It was essentially just an update to our planning regs. And we knew that they were outdated. We knew they needed an update. We knew that planning took way too long to develop a land use plan for a local area. It was taking sometimes 10 years or longer. So we actually reached out to our friends at the Forest Service who had just gone through a change of their own planning regulations. And we said, what is it? What did you find? You've been through a multi-year process. What was your fundamental learning that we should start with? And they said the most illogical thing, which is you need to add another step to your work. And that step is starting each process with a values-based discussion. Before you get to the point where you ask every entity what their resource need is, that you get everyone in a room and you say, this is your town. These are your public lands. This is your community writ large. Look across the room and see each other. And can we, over the course of a succession of evenings or days, talk about the values that are most important to us in this town, in this county, in this state, in this region? And by starting there, they were able to move much, much faster because there was so much less fighting along the way. There was so many fewer conflicts that needed to be unstrung. So, I think I see the Department of the Interior doing a lot of this similar work today, and the BLM heading in this direction, and I'm so excited about that. And I wonder if we don't need that kind of level of conversation about our public lands so that the American people can have easier access not only to the public lands themselves, but to understand how they're managed. Because I think it can be pretty tricky to look out on that landscape and understand the different agencies.
Could I add a point that some people have probably thought I was a crackpot forever suggesting this, Neil, but I'd love to hear your take on it. I've never talked to you about it. If you look at the Forest Service, if you look at the Park Service, if you look at all these other public land agencies, they are regionalized. The BLM is politicized because every single state has its own director. There is a borderline going down through an ecosystem where on one side it might be treated one way and the other side it might be treated differently because of who the US senators are in power in those states. I always felt that the system that the BLM had was really designed to let the US senators and congressmen run the agency instead of the directors of the states. And when I looked at the Park Service and these other outfits that were regionalized and had to look at things in sort of a bio-regional way, they seem to work better. They don't seem to have quite so much political pressure on them. Of course, they're not the big money makers, but still, if you really want to do some far range thinking, should the BLM still have state borders as their natural empires? That's what I would call it. Each little state has an empire for the BLM, and each little state operates slightly in a different way. I think that's not good. I think they need to look at ecosystems. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, Jim. And I will just say before I get directly to answering that I think co-location is as important as anything when it comes to interior agencies and other partners being in the same place. I think it can take literally years off a process if folks can meet at the corner and have a coffee and work things out, as opposed to spending 6 months drafting a letter in response to something. So I would just say as an example, in Reno, Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM are co-located in the same facility in Sparks, actually. They can walk down the hall and sort things out. In New Mexico, where you're sitting, BLM's in Santa Fe, I believe Fish and Wildlife Services in Albuquerque, there are more letters that go back and forth. And we saw that on projects like like Sunzia, where it was much longer and drawn out because of a lack of co-location. But Jim, I think I thought a lot about your question when I was at the agency, and sort of the conclusion that I came to a little bit too late was the agency does have regions, right? They're just called states, but the Oregon State office is Oregon and Washington. California office is California and Hawaii. New Mexico is New Mexico, Oklahoma, and I think Texas. Wyoming covers Nebraska. There are very few states that are actually states unto themselves. So, I think it's a choice that the agency can make as to what they want to call themselves. And I do think there may be some efficacy to thinking about the regional title.
Yeah, I really believe that's something that ought to be looked at, but I also know the kind of political fight that would happen. And I don't have a lot of hope that it will happen, but it ought to be considered, if not for all the states, at least for some of the energy producing states and states that have borders that are should be invisible. They really should be. I remember dealing with California BLM. I felt like I was an outsider. I don't feel that California ever felt that they had to answer to anybody. I don't think that Utah ever felt they had to answer to anybody because they had their own little systems in place. And it's not that they were all bad, because they weren't, but I didn't see that much coordination or that much attention being paid to what was going on in Washington, because there were powerful senators involved and powerful politicians and powerful extractive industries. And I think that's really hurt BLM's ability to manage like the Park Service or the Forest Service or any of the other agencies.
Yeah, and that's part of why I like this idea of a new public land commission or something along those lines, because I think, Jim, that the agency ends up dealing with a lot of problems on its own, right? You've identified one of many, I think. But if people could be invited to a table to say, okay, here are the real life challenges, and here are the laws that are in front of us, the regulations, the lanes that we've been given an opportunity to travel, do they match up? I think some of this, I think all these things deserve a hard conversation. So Jim, if I could toss a question to you? It's been a couple decades since you were in the seat. Like, do you have a couple? Like, is there something you're most proud of during those years? Think something that was very public or not very public?
Well, we didn't get much done in my short tenure, but I think one example of things that could be done system-wide for the BLM was the attempt that we had at grazing reform back in 1995, I guess it was, where you brought in experts from every state in grazing. And they actually tried to come up with a fair way of setting grazing fees depending on the ecosystems that you're in, and finding out what was the best science to use on kinds of grazing lands. I think that started going a long way towards solving some of these problems that we're seeing increasing desertification in the West.
We might have Jim frozen, Neil. So maybe we can turn that same question to you. What is something that you feel that you accomplished during your time that you are most proud of? I know we heard some reference to National Monument this morning, but I didn't know if you want to expound on that or some of the other initiatives.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that I was so proud to work with all my colleagues on, and some of those are renewable energy. I was excited to hear the discussion this morning of the 17,000 gigawatts that you're pushing on. I think we were able to get Congress set a target, some ambitious targets for the agency in the early days, and we met and exceeded them. I think we eventually got past about 15,000 megawatts, which was really exciting. And through the amazing work of people like Janaea Scott, who's back at the department, we're able to do a all of government approach where people were literally sitting down together week after week after week, coming up with solutions, which was really inspiring. Sage-grouse planting, Nada, no one understands that better than you. Looking west-wide, to Jim's thought about regional priorities, that was really hard, really cumbersome. There's got to be better ways to do it, but that will not be the last time that the agency needs to think across the entire western region. National monuments were, it was exciting to see President Obama step forward in those spaces, and Bears Ears, I think will be proudest of my whole life to be involved in. Basin and Range National Monument was really special. San Juan Islands, Fort Ord, there were really a lot of unique stories that went into each one of those. And then, I think there are huge energy questions that we were just at the front of trying to engage with, reforming the oil and gas program. There was a huge backlog of outdated regulations, just the undergirding of the oil and gas program that took up a huge amount of our capacity to redo and renew and bring into the modern era. And then in the last year or so, we were able to start to tackle some questions around the coal program. And all of these are, nation wasn't talking about climate change in such a clear-throated way back then, but it is now. And I think they were all sort of early steps in that dialogue. So I'm really excited, Nada, to see you and the team, really jumping into some of these hard topics.
Yeah, I think one of the differences for us is we do right now, we have a very clear mandate from the president. Some of his first actions were these executive orders on climate change, and that really is driving a lot of our work. And then, of course, his initial memo on improving nation-to-nation relationships with tribes. And that's really informing so much of what we're doing. And I am interested in your thoughts of how that is evolving. As you probably know, we're doing listening sessions this week and last week on updating our renewable energy program to meet this challenge. And maybe that is part of what we've learned, is to start with that discussion. It is, I'm not sure it counts quite as a values-based discussion, because obviously those who are, but I think it does, those who are participating are talking about their values in terms of climate change and how we address renewable energy and how we balance that with other concerns, be it environmental justice or other resources. So is that, do you see that as evolving of how we're approaching? To me, I see that as evolving of how we're approaching having these initial discussions before we, as you all were saying, just put something out for comment. But I am struck that we are addressing a lot of the issues you were addressing, Neil, and to Jim's point of us not making progress. I like to think we are making progress, that we've learned from the renewable energy efforts we did 10 years ago and are moving on. And would love both of your thoughts on if that is helpful to have these initial discussions before we dive into the specifics. It might take some more time, but it also might be more efficient as we've socialized some of our thoughts and heard what people are looking to see.
Jim, I don't know if you were back to hear that whole thing, but I'm happy to give the floor to you.
No, we're having some internet problems here in the neighborhood, which is very unusual. So sorry about that.
Got it. Well, I'll jump in and please jump in at any time. But Nada, it has been wonderful to see you taking that step to just get out early. And I think there is, it can look simple from the outside about, well, of course they should do that kind of thing, but there is a cumbersome nature to moving a government agency and some of the things that need to be done. So my hat is off to you for doing what you're doing, make it look so graceful as you do it. But I think that those, I think as you were talking about, building those relationships and being being true partners to all the communities that the BLM knows and works with. That's where I think about resources and staffing, and how and why the BLM needs so much more support. If you're going to have, it takes time to, as one former director used to say, have the relationship before you need it. And in order to go out and build that relationship, you need the time and the freedom to be there for people. And I don't know that that's always the case based on the existing allocation of resources. So.
But I would like to go back to ask you all a couple of questions to compare and contrast. So getting to a little bit of what we've discussed, the BLM does work with so many partners, other federal agencies, states, private landowners, and it's very difficult to make decisions that don't impact all of those. So I was wondering, from each of your perspectives, if you how did you approach working with those folks on this broader scale? You mentioned sage grouse, so maybe you want to mention that some more, but are there examples where you felt that really worked well, and other lessons you might have learned for all of us to hear going forward? Jim, do you want to start?
Yeah, you could actually work pretty well with some of the state land commissioners around the West, and the Pueblos, pretty much, because I think the Bureau of Indian Affairs would get involved, and then I worked with the Pueblos in New Mexico pretty well because I knew them, and I worked with them as state land commissioner. I think the Bureau of Land Management had an awful lot of employees that could see a big picture, even back then. And they've always had that. They've always had good people working for them. And I think they did the best they could in working with everybody else. There's some groups that, even the extractive industries, I think at some point, except for the higher political levels, you could actually work with them to work out some pretty good solutions to problems that might be going on. And I give credit for that to the people on the ground. A lot of the people on the ground were just very, very professional, and they really knew their stuff. So hopefully that continues. You could work with the other agencies, the Park Service and everybody else. The land trades always seemed to go pretty smooth when I was there. And I don't know what your experience was, Neil, but I think those land exchanges where land offices and private entities and folks all teamed up to do three-way trades and stuff, that usually was pretty interesting to work on, and actually good results for everybody. So
yeah, we specifically on land trades, I think that has become less common over the years. But I would say, and Nada, to your larger point about working things out and working with people, and one of my strongest memories of working with BLM was during the sage-grouse effort. It really just comes down to people, right? People building relationships and trusting each other. And we would we worked on sage-grouse for about 3 years straight. And during that time, every 6 weeks, like clockwork, we would have a meeting somewhere in the West where Fish and Wildlife Service, every relevant governor's office, BLM, Forest Service would sit around a giant table, usually in some awful windowless conference room near a hotel or near an airport. And we would try to hash things out for 2 or 3 days. And so, I think the first day was always rough because everyone had been back in their corners and working on a lot of different things and headed in different directions, partially due to the different priorities that the different authorizing legislation gives the agencies. But by day 2, we were always back in it and pushing forward and finding pathways. And I think there were a lot of things that made the sage-grouse process possible, but that was definitely one of them, was the in-person time. And which makes me think about the recent announcement last week to the NADA, where you're pulling the headquarters back to DC, which I think is so important given your relationship with Congress and the rest of the administration. being there on equal footing. But also I love the choice to continue having a Western headquarters still, as the largest public land management agency in the country. It only makes sense that you would also have a Western footprint where you can bring people together. These types of big conversations that we had during the Sage-Grouse effort, and the many, many challenges you have ahead of you over time. I still scratch my head about Grand Junction being the choice, given that you can barely get there from anywhere in terms of flights.
Right.
But the concept as a whole, I'm a huge fan of. So I want to compliment the team for making the bold decision that you did.
Yeah.
Thank you. Duly noted comments. And we're looking forward to continuing to expand on the approach and see how we can really use it to support the BLM's function. There's a lot of potential there, as you know, Neil, and we're excited about that opportunity. Jim, did you want to say something?
Nada, I'm really happy to see this movement back to Washington, but I'm a little bit concerned, and maybe somebody can enlighten me as to how we're going to find a way to get these employees back that all left BLM. And that was a great brain drain, it seemed to me. Will they come back? I guess that's the big question, or will they stay wherever they went? Any comments?
One thing that has been consistent since the rather abrupt relocation and the loss of so many people is we do have a lot of vacancies, and we're looking forward to starting to move forward to fill those, and making the BLM someplace people really want to work, whether it's in the Western headquarters or the national headquarters in DC. Really hoping that that will help us fill our vacancies with really excited people, people with experience and people who are new and excited about the BLM to start their careers. But we have a lot of options.
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope that you can recruit those folks and maybe go to the universities and start a whole new generation of leaders. And I have a lot of faith in these young people that might be coming to work for you. I think they get it. I think they know what's going on, and they're going to have to deal with it long after we're gone about what's going on. So I'm hopeful. I really am. Last week, my wife and I, Bobby, went on a 2,600 mile road trip through the West. And we saw a lot of BLM lands, a lot of forest lands. We went through Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Idaho. And it was a real test for my Tesla. And we never once ran out of juice. I want you to know that. Even in these Western states, they have chargers. But you really begin to understand, and I had forgotten, I hadn't taken a trip like that, about the large, seemingly empty expanses of the Western United States that is controlled by our federal land management agencies. It's dramatic. And I wish everybody could look at it in the way that all of a sudden I rediscovered it last week. It was really something to behold, going across southern Wyoming and seeing these beautiful landscapes again. I wish everybody could see it like that and see how important it is to the future of the United States.
So if we have a second, Nada, I was wondering if I could turn the tables for just a second and ask you a question. In my years in the agency, as I looked out into the world and sometimes was looking for not only an outside perspective, but experts on the BLM and what it is and what it does. You were always top of the list for me, Nada. You understood the agency and its operations in ways that probably no one else in the world did. And so I always felt very lucky to get your perspective on things. And so I wonder, as you've gone inside the agency now, if there's been any surprises for you, what were your expectations versus, when you got in there, what did you find?
I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat that. You're breaking up.
Oh, sorry, Jim. Neil was asking me what surprises I found when I joined the BLM from the inside after spending so many years working with the BLM from various other positions and perspectives. Yeah. And the first surprise was how many acronyms there were that I didn't know. I thought I really was fluent, in BLM, and
still don't
I
know.
think I am, but there were still more. And what that represented is, the incredible machinery that is operating behind the scenes to keep everything going, from offices to personnel. Also, how challenging it is to hire. We've heard a lot that we are missing out on people because it takes us a long time. We hire through some challenging procedures, and that was something really that I was surprised at how challenging it was. And I'm glad to say we are trying to work with some organizations that can help people navigate with us. But that was some of the biggest surprise was that, even if we had the commitment and the time and the funding, it can still be challenging to hire and fill all of the processes and obligations. And also, frankly, what we paid people who worked on fires. So there was a recent initiative started with the president and now the BLM and other agencies to really address how people who fight fires, which is becoming a year-round thing, and takes so much time and power and people, that those were all seasonal folks and that they were paid in a certain way, and that makes it really difficult for us to support them as part of our team. So that was one of the surprises, and I guess those are rather technical surprises. The other thing that was a good surprise was that people were willing to talk to me after I darkened their doors for years with lists and lists of demands and fabulous ideas. That so many people at the BLM were willing to keep talking to me and reach out to me, be it on many of our internal processes or meetings. And so that was actually a welcome surprise that I felt like there really is a desire to move forward and to have some clear mandates that everyone can get behind. So that was kind of the nicest surprise.
Neil, I kind of envied you when you took office because you had a lot of experience in the federal government already. I was just some hick coming from New Mexico that had never worked for the federal government, although my wife was a career Forest Service agency employee. And I tell you what, I was just lost. I was lost for 6 months. I was reading the FLIPMA Act. I was reading all this other stuff. And I just couldn't keep it all separated sometimes and figure out how they interacted with each other. And it's almost like many of our folks that come from the nonprofit agencies, the non-governmental organizations that come into the federal government, they have a lot to absorb. And then they have a lot of responsibilities to get things going quickly. So I think it probably helps to have a little federal government experience, at least with the NGOs. If you're in charge of federal government relationships and stuff, you'd probably have an easier time of it. I was used to working on state lands. We didn't quite have all of the rules and regulations that the feds did. So it was hard for me. It really was. And getting experienced people into these positions right at the outset is really important. And getting them to work as fast as possible. That's why I'm concerned about the BLM still not having a permanent director. They really need to confirm her and get it done.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I think I was fortunate to be able to draft behind other people at the agency for a couple of years and get myself up to speed a little bit. So I didn't have to come in totally fresh. But I was also super, super lucky to have an amazing team to work with. Steve Ellis had a long career at the BLM and Forest Service and was a great partner. Linda Lance, who I will miss forever, was an enormous talent. And people like Jenna Whitlock just really, stood with the president's priorities, stood with leadership and, didn't just help guide the ship, they guided the ship. Right. That was one of the things that I really tried to lean into, was making sure that career leadership was front and center, and that it was an integrated team, and it was. So
I have a suggestion too, Neil, and I'd love to hear your feelings about it. And that is, things are going to be so much different in the next 50 years because of climate change, because of everything else that's going on. We worry about our firefighters, and I don't know of any fire that was ever stopped just by firefighters. The weather is a big part of it, and the weather could cooperate a lot sometimes. That's not going to happen much anymore. And is there, Nada, is there any efforts within the Department of Interior and other public land management agencies to figure out a new way of doing things, given what we're facing with climate change and stuff? Because I don't think the old ways are going to work very much anymore. I really don't. Not just on firefighting, but on a lot of things. On water issues, watershed management, everything else, things are going to be different. And what's being done to kind of look that far into the future. I know the 30 by 30 plan is big. I sit on the board of the Weiss Foundation, and we've done a lot of work on 30 by 30. I hope that the federal government looks at what the NGOs are doing, coming up with some of these new ideas, and embraces them and starts some real think tanks on figuring out how we're going to do this stuff in the future.
Yeah, it is, changing landscape in every way, right? From climate to also the priorities that we're, privileged to be implementing, things like the America the Beautiful, and focusing on climate change and focusing on tribal leadership. These are, all new things. So I think it's been great. And we are looking at, for fire, of course, we can't just be responsive to the fire. And I would say our fire program is now becoming more proactive. So, and looking at that. And I think we're doing that with so many resources. How do we plan ahead? And as we, look at science of what's changing on the ground and how do we respond? But there's a lot of that, I think, in the discussions around the ideas of 30% of lands and waters being conserved by 2030, of how do we address what Neil mentioned right at the beginning, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis. Those are proactive actions, and that does really change the tenor of the discussion instead of just being so responsive, and gives us a chance to look out in the long term. I did want to ask you both about something we're starting up for the BLM, which is our BLM Foundation, that was authorized in legislation quite a few years ago, but was never stood up. And we're working now to identify some board members and get the foundation formally running, and would love to hear your thoughts on the value of that. And Jim, you mentioned other agencies, and BLM didn't have a foundation, but others do, and what kind of goals you see and what a difference this foundation could make. So Neil, I know you were involved in it a lot. I don't know if you want to start us off.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Very exciting, Nada, that you're pushing forward with the foundation and looking to get it launched. The idea when we were working on the legislation around this was, was pretty fundamentally based on the idea that the more oars you have in the water, the further you can travel, and sometimes BLM is left on its own, and to solve really hard questions. And so, the hope was that there could be a external entity that would be supportive of the organization, could also maybe, find new pathways for the agency to explore, but also find ways for the agency to grow in its mission and in its activities. So, there's amazing organizations like the National Forest Foundation, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, that do extraordinary work across the country on the lands with the agencies, for the agencies sometimes. And I can't think of a team that deserves that kind of support more. So, we knocked on doors for a few years to see if we could build some interest in that piece, and I was super proud to get it passed before the end of the Obama administration. So, really cool that you're lifting that up and going to stand it up in earnest.
I lost audio again. I'm sorry, but the question was about the BLM Foundation.
Yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts for the opportunities for the foundation. There, as Neil noted, there is the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. There's the Parks Foundation, the National Forest Foundation. They have pretty more narrow mandates, I would say. The BLM Foundation was created with some specific items referenced conservation, wild horses and burros, but there's also some very broad language that we can do anything really in our multiple use sustained yield mandate with the foundation. So was interested in your all thoughts on priorities for that and how it could work best to help us as
I would
transition.
have to say that my priorities were that the foundation focus mainly on good science for the foundation, for the BLM, that they support science and research and factual kinds of things. You can do a lot of do good things, but I think science has been under such attacks lately that foundations really ought to concentrate on making people believe in science again. And especially for the BLM, I think that's important on protection of landscapes and watersheds in the West. I really do.
Thanks. One other, hopefully not a stumper question that I wanted to mention. When I've been speaking a lot lately about, for instance, America the Beautiful or changes to the grazing regulations, wild horses and burros, energy, what always comes up is, these are all parts of our multiple use and sustained yield mission, and we tend to shorthand that as multiple use. I do get really interesting comments and questions about what about sustained yield? Where does that fit in? I think, Neil, you and I talked about this a lot in the past when our roles were somewhat reversed, but would love to hear how your thinking has evolved there. And Jim, what you might have done in wrestling with that kind of and part of the BLM's mission.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
thank you for the question. Yeah, thanks, Jim. It was something that I talked about a lot when I was on the stump for the BLM about how important it is to say the full sentence, multiple use and sustained yield. If you go to FLTMA to nerd out here, I think it's in section 103, it gives you the mission, gives you the definitions, and all 5 words I think matter. That the use comes with the yield, and the sustainability of all of that matters at an essential level. And so I think when sage grouse popped up as a major crisis that needed to be solved, I looked hard at that language and was thinking, how much of this crisis belongs to the Bureau of Land Management, right, and some of our prior decisions. And I do think that part of it comes back to maybe forgetting those last 3 words in the mission, the and sustained yield, because the agency is required to bring a sustained high or annual level, essentially output of renewable resources. And one of those resources that's under the keep of the agency is wildlife habitat. And there are so many others, recreational resources, lots of other pieces. So I would just encourage everyone, and there's a toddler in the background again, sweet little guy. I just encourage everyone to add those 3 words in when you're talking about the agency, because I think until the agency embraces the sustained yield part of the mission, that it's only halfway to the goal line.
And you think it encompasses conservation and recreation as well as other quote unquote resources?
Nada, I'm having a lot of internet problems here. I'm probably going to have to sign up because I can't hear.
Yeah,
anything.
I think we'll wind it up, Jim. Thank you.
And I'm really sorry about this. Usually we have just spectacular internet here, so I don't know what's going on. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I really want to wish the BLM the best of luck. It can be a very important agency for the future of this country, especially in the West. So thank you very much. Okay.
Thanks, Jim. Any parting words for us, Neil? And then we'll let you go deal with the multiple use sustained yield of fatherhood.
I will echo my well wishes and my thanks to the amazing team that you work with every day, Nada. Thank you for your leadership in particular over the last many months, just jumping in there and some really hard questions. And I think the task is 75 years and 200 years out. Right? I think there really tremendously long timelines that it absolutely makes sense to grapple with every day. What an extraordinary opportunity to do so. So wish you well and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. And thanks all for listening to our conversation and our technical challenges and our multitasking challenges. And, I think we're going to give folks a break so they can get lunch or afternoon snack, depending which time zone you're on right now. And we'll be coming back for our last panel on America the Beautiful at 3-ish Eastern. So thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Neil.